Hi, everyone, and welcome. I think we can go ahead and get started now. And to kick things off, firstly, thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. I am particularly excited for this conversation and the opportunity to learn from two impressive people in this sector. And before introducing Brent and Emily, I want to start with a quick introduction to GreenSpace, some background on why we decided to create this session, and a couple of housekeeping items. So, my name is Simon Weiss. I'm the president at GreenSpace Health. GreenSpace was launched out of an academic research hospital to bridge the gap between research and clinical practice when it comes to the measurement of patient care in mental health, behavioral health, and substance use services. Today, our technology and team are supporting more than 400 organizations with the implementation of measurement-based care, and ultimately with the goal of improving patient outcomes. Now, for these organizations, one of the major benefits that we see both in research and in our active implementations is the direct impact that measurement-based care can have on the client and clinician relationship. And for many of our partners, actually measuring that therapeutic alliance has really enhanced these benefits for clients and the value of MBC for organizations. So, as I'm sure everybody has probably worked out by now, the focus of today's session is on therapeutic alliance. And we chose this topic for a few reasons. First, as I mentioned, we're seeing this topic have a major positive impact for our partners. And we wanted to sort of share out what we're learning and the experience of Brent and Emily to support others. Second, the Brief Revised Working Alliance Inventory, or the BR-WAI, is one of the assessment tools that our team gets asked about most frequently. It's also one of the most utilized tools on our platform. To date, there's been almost 100,000 assessments completed with an average normalized score of about 82%. And third, and probably most importantly, the research shows that therapeutic alliance is really one of the core predictors of symptom change in behavioral health treatment. And that's ultimately what we're all trying to accomplish. So the purpose of today's session is to dive deep into this topic and learn as much as we possibly can about how it can effectively be incorporated into clinical practice, clinical supervision, and an organization's evaluation framework. Unfortunately, I'd like to add that it seems like this topic has really resonated for others in our network. We've had almost 450 people. I think last count was 425 or 430 people sign up for this session. So huge thank you to everybody for your interest. And I hope you find it as valuable as we think you will. And now, before we actually jump into things, a final order of business are housekeeping items. So we have time at the end scheduled for Q&A. We'll protect that time. We'll make sure we get to those questions. Please add your questions into the Zoom Q&A list or box, not to the chat. In the Zoom Q&A feature, we're going to be using the upvoting function. So press the thumbs up icon for questions you want to hear us talk about. When we get to the Q&A, we'll start with the questions that have the most votes. And then finally, at the end of the session, there's a feedback form. This is really, really helpful for our team, especially around planning future educational events. Please fill that out. We'd really appreciate it. And now let's get into the conversation. So I want to start with introductions for Brent and Emily. Maybe Emily, if you're willing to start, maybe take a minute to introduce yourself, and then Brent can go next.
Absolutely. Thank you, Simon. So hello, everybody. I am Emily Miller. I am a master's level psychotherapist, currently working for an agency called Pinebrook Family Answers. We are an urban-based community mental health agency working in Eastern Pennsylvania. We do have a variety of services, but I work in the outpatient services sector of that. So I work with individuals, couples, and families. Being urban-based, I get to see people from a variety of backgrounds, and many of the clients that we see tend to have government-issued insurance. I work with all age groups as well. So the youngest client that I've had has been about like 7 years old, and then the oldest I've had has been well into their 70s. I also have a research background from Moravian College, which is now university. That's where I got my undergrad from, in peer interactions, victimization, and bullying. And I got my master's degree from LaSalle University in Philadelphia in professional clinical counseling in 2021. I'm currently pursuing my licensure in the state of Pennsylvania. Hopefully that happens in the fall if everything goes according to plan, but I'm very excited to be here and thank you for having me.
Thanks, Emily, and over to you, Brent.
Okay, thanks, and welcome everybody. I am a professor of psychology at Western Washington University in Bellingham. It's the most northwesterly campus in the continental United States. I teach undergraduate courses in psychology, but we also have a master's training program and an in-house clinic. So I supervise the master's students who see adult clients that come into our department for free therapy services. I do a lot of research on the counseling relationship. That's my primary interest. And in 2015, with my colleague and former student Jakob Tike, we developed the brief revised working alliance inventory. And Simon, if I may, add something really important from the outset is to give proper credit to Leslie Greenberg and Adam Horvath. They are the original developers of the 36-item working alliance inventory. My contribution was to take their 36 items that they created and select a subset of 18 that make a reasonably performing brief instrument. But Adam and Les Greenberg were the pioneers who developed the original measure and just deserve huge credit. I want to be sure that we do that right from the outset. So thanks and welcome everybody.
Perfect. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Emily. Maybe to get the conversation started, Therapeutic Alliance is really about the relationship between therapist and client. So do they think the same things are important? Are they headed in the same direction? That seems simple on the face of it, but I expect there is much more to that. And that's what we're here to talk about. So Brent, I know you've published extensively on the counselor-client relationship. And as you just mentioned, you're the co-author of one of the BR-WAI, one of the most utilized assessments on our platform. And I'm hoping you can kind of provide the context here and share a bit about what Working Alliance or Therapeutic Alliance is.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I think we start with every therapy that's delivered by one person to another person. That therapy is a relationship. And so the working alliance is the essence of that relationship. It's the bond that forms between a client and counselor. And there's really three components of the working alliance, and each one of those is important. So the bond component is that relationship of mutual trust and regard that really happens in the very first seconds after the client and counselor meet. And we know that mutual respect is important because, like from medical research, when a patient likes their doctor or nurse, they're more willing to comply with difficult medical procedures, the ones that they don't like very much. And so when the bond component of the alliance is strong, our clients are willing to explore difficult, troubling material. And they work hard for us because they respect and like us. So the bond is the first component. It's very important. There are two other components that tend to develop a little bit later. And those are the tasks and the goals component of the alliance. So the goals are our treatment goals, what we work towards with the clients, their hopes for therapy outcomes. And then the tasks, it's sort of the tools that we use to get to that destination. What work together are we proposing to reach the goals that the clients propose? The key word here, I think, is agreement. So the tasks and goals component of the alliance involve the client having buy-in, understanding what we're doing, and agreeing that this is a good way to proceed. You'll see that some of the items on the Working Alliance inventory tap that idea of understanding and agreement about the work of therapy. So three components, all important.
Well, thanks, Brett. And I feel like in our leading up to this conversation, one of the things that stood out to me was also the impact that Working Alliance has on the variance in client outcomes. And just sort of shed light on a number. I think you mentioned as early as session 3 to 5, we're seeing work in alliance account for about a quarter of the variance in client outcomes. That was a really, really meaningful number when I was sort of thinking about the prep for this conversation.
That's right. There's been some very large meta-analyses that combine data from many studies. And by about the third session, certainly by the fifth session, the quality of the working alliance as measured at that point predicts about 25% of the eventual outcome, which is, I don't think we have any other single indicator that predicts outcomes so well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's a piece that has always really stood out for me and excites me about, seeing our partners leverage a tool like this and what it can mean for their work. So Emily, I want to pass it to you next. You've been using the BR-WAI in your practice. And I'd love for you to take a few minutes to share how you've put it into practice and what that actually looks like.
Absolutely. So at Pinebrook, we are required every 6 months to do what we call a treatment plan review. When we do those reviews, it's essentially a check-in with our clients of, hey, are we working on what you still want to be working on? Do we need to add anything? Do we need to change anything, take anything away? Things like that. At the end of every single one of those reviews, we're required to put in the overall score from the BR-WAI. So at a minimum, the clinicians that at our agency are using this assessment with their clients once every 6 months. I choose to start using this assessment with clients about 2 months into therapy. So that's about anywhere from like 5 to 7 sessions under your belt at that point. And then after that 2 months, I do it once every 2 months. So every other as a check-in, slightly more than just 6 months at a time. So that's how I like to try to use it. And I'll generally just say, hey, like how are we doing? And just using that as a general check-in for them.
Well, thanks for sharing. And I think you started to frame a little bit this idea of like checking in and the, hey, how you're doing with clients. But one thing that we often hear as feedback from teams and clinicians is, there can be some uncertainty and hesitation around actually introducing an assessment like this for the first time, right? And I'm particularly interested in like the language you've found to be useful and how you're describing the BR-WAI and Therapeutic Alliance and its purpose to clients when you're initially introducing this tool.
Absolutely. So what I do is I just call it what it is to them. I say, what we're doing here is a relationship much like anything else in your life, right? So there's romantic relationships, platonic, friendships, professional. This is just a different kind of relationship here. And this assessment that we're going to do or that you're going to do, I should say, is just a really good way for me to check in on how you and I are doing here. Sometimes clients can feel a little awkward about it. I'm sure us as clinicians have seen that happen in sessions because you're essentially giving them an assessment of, "Ooh, do you like me?" or it can feel like that to them. And so what I do is I'll tell them, this is your opportunity to just roast me by any means possible if you need to. And then they'll laugh and they'll be like, okay. And then they'll take it. But then, I think a big part of introducing this to them is the energy that you bring into it. And that goes for any assessment, not just the BR-WAI, the energy that you bring into giving it to them. So if you're treating this as, oh, well, I have to do this once every 6 months, so boom, here you go. And that they're going to match that, I think, on some level. But if you treat this as, hey, your feedback here is really valuable to me. I want to hear what you have to say and actually mean that when you say it. I think they pick up on that energy and I think they are willing to give you that honest feedback. A big part of it is me assuring them, you're not going to hurt my feelings. No matter what you say here, you're not going to hurt my feelings at all. I think this is a great opportunity, this introduction of this measure, to take yourself off the pedestal for them, right? Because we're people just like you. So that's generally how I try to introduce this is, hey, this is a relationship and I want to know more about what you think of this relationship.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. And I find one of the things that constantly comes up in conversation with our partners is this really this idea of how do you make measurement really valuable and meaningful to the client, and this idea that you mentioned of you need to bring energy to it, right? It can't, you're not going to get much out of it or the buy-in from a client if this feels like a data reporting exercise.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think the extension from the BR-WAI to other assessment tools is really important in that same regard. Although this one, from an outsider's perspective, I'd say this one to me always felt like it might be more awkward or challenging to introduce. So yeah, that overview is really, really helpful.
Yeah. And another thing I'd like to add is with this particular measure, I mean, it's different and unique in the fact that the questions that it's asking the clients are questions that we just don't get in our everyday lives, right? So how often do you turn to a friend and you ask, would you still like me if I did something that you didn't like, right? I mean, maybe we do, but that's not usually feedback that we get from people in our lives. So I would say don't be surprised to see your clients maybe get a little bit jarred from some of the questions the first few times they take this. It's not necessarily bad that it's jarring. It's just not feedback that we're used to getting in our everyday lives.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't get that question very often. And maybe as one more follow-up, like in your experience, have you found clients that you're working with show much reluctance after doing that first assessment? Have you had people push back and say, I'm not comfortable, rating my experience and rating the alliance?
Mm-hmm. So I actually have not had any issues with clients taking this at all, at least not in my experience yet. They tend to maybe be a little wary of it at first, because I think maybe they worry about hurting my feelings. But other than that, they seem very willing to take this assessment.
Okay, thanks, Emily. I want to shift direction a little bit and get into some more detail on the actual assessment tool. So, the BR-WAI yields a total score and 2 subscales. Brent, are you able to share how you would recommend using each of these 3 data points in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question, Simon. Thank you. I think back, I was lucky to meet Ed Borden, one of the original theorists of the Working Alliance, and he talked about the alliance as similar to a stool with 3 legs, to emphasize that each of the 3 components are important. And he said that if your alliance has only 2 of the 3, it's like sitting on a stool with only 2 legs. And well, we kind of know what happens. We know what position we end up in when we sit on a stool that's missing a leg. So that just highlights the importance that both of the subscale scores are important. And then you may be wondering, well, 3 legs, why only 2 subscales? The reason for that is that the bond measure is the common measure that's part of all 3. And I've talked about mutual liking and trust. Therapists, I think, are well advised to consider tasks and goals separately. So we set treatment goals with clients, and then a whole separate conversation is, after we've chosen those goals with their agreement, what tasks are we going to pursue to achieve those goals? But I think clients don't think of those things separately. They just think of the work of therapy that involves tasks and goals mixed together. So in the BR-WAI, tasks and goals are rolled together for clients. I still think it's important for therapists to think of them separately. And actually, in my setting here in the treatment clinic, I'm working with master students who are seeing their very first client, very nervous. And it's not unusual for us to have these 2 scores quite different. So the bond tends to be something that new therapists can develop relatively quickly. They're pretty good at developing rapport, but they really struggle with setting treatment goals and tasks. And so you're getting client feedback, essentially, I like you, I respect you, I feel good about our relationship. I don't know where we're going. I don't know whether we're using our time in the best way. I'm kind of unclear about what's unfolding in the therapy. So that would be an example of a high bond score and a relatively lower task goals score from the client's perspective. And when we get that feedback, when any of us do, of course, students panic about it, but any of us who get the score that's lower than we might want, it's just a signal that we need to go to work on maybe the client doesn't understand the goals as much as we thought they did, or maybe they agreed with a treatment goal kind of superficially, but they still don't really know what we're doing, or why are you having me keep this journal? Why are you having me report my thoughts to you? So we need to do some more work to make sure that they have buy-in and agreement. I have never, in my work, I have never seen the opposite pattern where tasks and goal score is high and bond is low. But I suppose there could be a situation of like a master technician who's really good at their craft, at their skills, but the client doesn't particularly like them. So that's where you might have tasks and goals high, but bond not as high. And I just emphasize that we need to pay attention to both scores. And when one of them is lower than the norms, it's a signal to us that we need to do some more work in that area.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Brandon. It's, this is one of the measures on our platform that like our team gets a lot of feedback on. And the way that it's presented on GreenSpace is you sort of have your total score and 2 subscales and kind of track how they progress and trend over time. And sort of the customer stories we hear and the conversations that I hear, these anecdotes and kind of qualitative feedback, that seems to be a really impactful way in which people are using it. And I think the way you've laid out, kind of typical patterns around bonds versus tasks and goals is also what we're hearing in those stories. And it's a pretty impactful feature that I think is well used by clinicians so far as we've heard in practice. Now, we've kind of talked about the most common situation you set out, especially, the clinical supervision work that you're doing with, new trainees working in their first with their first clients. What kind of advice do you work on, or what kind of advice can you share with with the attendees here for practitioners who are looking to improve their bond scores on the BR-WAI with clients, since that's the more common pattern where you see the, but early on in treatment, that bond is really important and probably the first thing you need to start thinking about.
And yes, and here we often, I think, every relationship involves cultural differences. No 2 people are from identical cultures or have identical identities, if that makes sense. And so when the bond score needs some work, I think part of that is the work of bridging multiple identities. So for counselors to do deep listening, for clients to feel understood if they identify themselves with an oppressed group or marginal identity. That happens a lot on our college campuses. Or they look at the counselor and say, you're different than me in some very obvious way. You're older, you're younger, you appear to be male. So how can you understand me when we have these obvious differences? And bridging that gap with empathy, with cultural humility, with deep listening, those are the ways that I think are the best advice for building the bond score. And then, Emily, I'll just take a page from something you were saying, is just asking the client, just saying, our score on this scale is not where I would like it to be. What can I do to work more closely with you? How can we work more closely together? And getting the client's advice about that.
Right. And maybe to take it from the research and Brent, the clinical supervisor hat that you wear, and pull this into practice. Emily, when we're preparing for this this webinar, you mentioned that the assessment sometimes surfaces results that have surprised you and led you into a different approach with a client. Hoping you can share an example with us to help really make that a bit more tangible for everyone.
Absolutely. So one client comes to mind. She was a teenager, and as I said before, I don't give this assessment until I've seen a client for a couple of months. And in that first couple of months, I just had that gut feeling of, oh my gosh, this girl hates my guts. Like there is no way. I'm sure those of us who are clinicians, like we know that feeling, we just know. And I remember going to my clinical supervisor, Gina, at the time, being like, how am I going to navigate this? It's a very intimate thing to be in therapy. And if you hate your therapist, where do you go with that? I ended up giving this young woman, this teenager, the assessment, and I was cringing on the inside. I'm like, I don't think it's possible to get a 0 on this assessment, but she'll find a way. Like there's this, it's going to happen. But what ended up happening was she gave a very high score, like almost close to perfect. So I'm sitting there thinking to myself, like, that's very surprising. And so I brought that up to her. I said, this is my perception of what's been happening in therapy. Not gonna lie, I was a little surprised to see you rate our relationship as highly as you did. What ended up coming from that conversation was this idea that she felt once she felt comfortable in a relationship, the edges would start to come out. She would start to push people away. And that ended up becoming the forefront of what she and I would be working on in therapy, is that, maybe doing that to people isn't in your best interest, and also digging into maybe the trauma history of why we became this way. So that was one example that I think, or one conversation, I should say, that would not have necessarily come about as easily or as quickly without using this assessment.
Amazing. Thanks, Emily. And I mean, I think that's a great example of, this has come up in sort of past educational events with the Yale MBC collaborative, but this idea of staying curious and really using assessment results to improve the quality of conversations you're having. And, from this, the seat I'm in, these anecdotes and these stories from clinicians and teams around the BR-WAI are so often about a surprise that the clinician had in terms of the response, and how that then took, treatment and therapy and conversations down a different path. So I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
If we were gonna, in this example, you saw a higher bond score than you expected, led you down a different path. If we were going to flip this, do you have an example of an instance where you saw a high bond score, but the task and goal subscores were surprisingly low, so unexpected on the, the other direction?
Yes, I do. So I have another client that came to mind, and this was more recently, where this client, she was in her 50s about. And again, within that first 2 months of therapy, I got the sense that she was comfortable, very open about things, very open about her past. Like, I knew on some level she was doing okay in the bond score. I was expecting something high, and I did get a relatively high score on that first assessment. But what happened was the task score was a little lower. And so I, again, used that as an opportunity to be able to speak with her and say, can you tell me maybe a little bit more about what's going on here? And she echoed back kind of what I was expecting of, well, I am comfortable with you, but I feel like I'm just trauma dumping here in session. I feel very free. And honestly, I sometimes don't even know what I'm saying. And it makes me feel like I'm doing therapy wrong. So that was incredible insight that I'm not sure I normally would have gotten as a therapist, to hear that from her. Because the way I approach therapy with adults is to usually empower them by letting them lead where they want session to go. So if they come in wanting to talk about how much they hate their job that day, that's what we're going to talk about. But for her, that empowerment, it was not empowering at all. It was actually incredibly triggering due to events that had happened in her past. So that shifted the way I worked with her to, instead of just letting her bring what she wanted to session, it was more of a check-in and more structure at the beginning of session, asking something like, well, we were talking about this last week. Do you want to pick up where you left off, or do you want to talk about something different? Or maybe something even more directive, like, you've mentioned wanting to work on this in the past. Would you be open to talking more about this today? And since then, I think she has felt that there is more meaningful work happening in therapy. And so the task score has definitely gone up over time due to me kind of adding more structure to the session.
Okay, great. I mean, I appreciate how that maps to Brent, when you were sort of talking about the measure and kind of typical experience in terms of what clinicians see. I appreciate how that pattern really maps. And Brent, you kind of went through the example of how do we work as a clinician to really emphasize and build that bond score early? curious if you can share some thoughts for clinicians who are seeing that high bond and just as Emily spoke about, are now in a situation where they have a low task and goal score. And, in the role that you have as clinical supervisor, just how you kind of work through that with the students that you're supporting.
Yes, thanks. I think when we have a time limit here, it's generous. It's 20 weeks. It's more than people get at many other agencies, but still that time limit weighs heavily on our students, and they're eager to get going, and they're being graded and evaluated. And so I think they have some pressure to get to work quickly with the client, set a goal, use the the theoretical orientation that they've learned in the last week, the approach of the week, so to speak. And the problem is that the client hasn't been brought along. The client isn't in full agreement about the goals of therapy, or maybe somebody in their life, a partner or family member, is not on board and undermining those goals. So if the client works towards that therapeutic destination, somebody is going to be unhappy with them. There's all sorts of reasons why goals are more complicated than we might first assume. And it's just critically important that the client understand the goals and not in jargon terms. And then that's only part of the agreement. I'd say that's only half of the agreement, because even if I am in agreement with a client about reducing anxiety, they may not agree with the tasks that I propose. So if I'm putting together an exposure ladder of ever increasing anxiety, and we're going to work on tackling the first rung of that ladder this week, they just may not believe that that's going to work for them. And if I forge forward and try to do that without their buy-in, that's what's going to lead to the low task goal score. And as much as I might want to get to work quickly, there's still work to be done. I'm sort of skipping ahead. I'm skipping an essential step that really can't be skipped. I guess, and I want to say one more thing about how tasks and goals and bonds work together, because I'm also very interested in attachment theory. And I've done a lot of work on the attachment relationship between client and counselor. And particularly for traumatized clients, it's going to be difficult for them to trust. They will develop the bond very slowly and very painfully. And maybe when the bond score is high and they have a good relationship with us, a big part of the therapeutic work is finished, because they've learned to trust someone in a way that maybe they've never trusted anyone like this before. So I'm suggesting, might seem kind of convoluted, but that for some clients with attachment trauma in their past, developing a good bond becomes a therapeutic goal in itself. Our goal is to develop a good bond first, and then we move from that to other things.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. And I can imagine, particularly in the first half of that, the way you've talked through it, if you have a strong bond, it makes it much easier to reset that conversation with a client when you're seeing misalignment on tasks and goals. So being able to step back and reset is kind of a key function there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Emily, we've kind of talked through how you introduce the BR-WAI to clients. We've talked through a couple, say, surprising examples when you see scores in different places. Now I hope you can kind of take us through, just on a general sense, how do you discuss assessment results with clients? And you're doing this on a 2-month basis. So what does that actually look like in practice?
Absolutely. So Green Space, the features that we have through Green Space with clients taking the assessment and then seeing their results is they can either take the assessment at home by themselves. There is a kiosk feature where I can send them the assessment to take, whether it's in the waiting room or whether it's in the same room as me, or sometimes if it's virtual, I have to share my screen and click the answers they tell me to click for them. Regardless, though, when I'm giving the client the results, I share my screen with them. Whether if it's in person, I just flip my laptop. If it's virtual, I just share my screen. I forget where I was going with that, but basically, so I share my screen pretty much. What I tend to see is that first time you take that assessment, you can expect to see kind of a medium score, middle of the line score. And then as you are with them with time, it tends to go up. But regardless of whatever the score is, when you share these results with the client, it's not like you just show the score and be like, okay, so you got a 72 on this, and then take it away. It's the beginning of a much bigger conversation. So what I like to try to do with my clients after they're done taking it is I ask them 2 questions that actually target the 2 subscores of this assessment. The first question asks, what can we be doing to make you feel more comfortable in session? Notice I said we, because it's not all on me that you feel comfortable here. It's also not all on the client that they feel comfortable here. It's a working relationship, right? So that first question, what can we be doing to make you feel more comfortable, is key, and it sparks usually a very good conversation. The second question that I ask is, what can we be doing to make your time here feel more meaningful? And that targets the tasks subscore. And I almost always get great conversations from there. Sometimes the clients will just say, I don't know, like, I'm doing pretty good. Like, I feel fine in this. And that might be as far as you get. And that's fine at that time. Sometimes you'll get a couple sessions out of those 2 questions that you ask. But regardless of their answers too, the last thing I like to communicate with them is that it's my hope that they would be able to share these thoughts and feelings with me about the relationship that we have in other sessions outside of when we do this assessment, right? This isn't just a 2-month or 6-month check-in and then we get to talk about it. This is hopefully something that you can talk about with me of, hey, Emily, you know what, honestly, that made me feel very uncomfortable when you asked this question, or this isn't what I want to be working on today, right? This is something that's an ongoing conversation. This is just the assessment itself is just a great way to kind of start that conversation initially. And I would say too, seeing a low score, although we want our clients to feel comfortable, we want them to feel like they are having meaningful time. Seeing a high score isn't always necessarily the goal here, right? Sometimes it is even more helpful and meaningful to see a low score and be like, ooh, something might be going on here. Honestly, when I see those low scores, I'm like, sweet, we can talk about that next session. And it gives you great content to talk about. And I think Brent was talking about the attachment portion, trauma portion, and it all is at play, because a lot of times if whatever score we see, it can be a direct reflection of what's going on in this client's life right now, what happened in their past that maybe is informing them of how to navigate this relationship with me. And it is just an incredible way of checking in, again, the beginning of the conversation and not the end of it, for sure.
Yeah, really helpful, Emily. And, I particularly appreciate this concept of really empowering the client to be able to raise this, whether it's in the session that you're looking at results or otherwise. And it's something that we continue to see come up. One of the focuses for our team has been to create a lot of transparency and visibility for the client. Through the platform, there is an ability to give full access and transparency to results, whether that's on the BR-WAI or other measures. And I think we see this in the research, but really in practice, we see what that means for kind of client empowerment, equity, ability to step into a conversation and talk about the issues they're seeing and want to focus on. And so I really like how I think you've kind of created a model for doing that. Obviously, you're sharing the results with the client, but a model for doing that and the kind of the questions and conversations you're having. So love how you talked through that. And then maybe our last question here before jumping into the Q&A, because I'm seeing quite a few questions pile up in there and want to give ourselves some time. And Brent, I'll ask you this one. So, when I look at the BR-WAI and other assessments, I'm struck by the framing of some questions, right? So, for example, my therapist does not understand what I am trying to accomplish in therapy. Now, some are framed negatively, some are framed positively. Is there a reason why they're framed in this way instead of all of them being framed positively? So for example, my therapist understands what I'm trying to accomplish in therapy. Trying to, maybe if you could share for everybody, like, why is the does not and the negative framing important here?
Great question. Great question. There's a technical reason behind this, which I won't go into very much, but there's a human tendency for each question that we're asked to influence the next question. So if you have a series of questions where you form the habit of agreeing with the first 3 questions you're asked, you're very likely to agree to the 4th question almost no matter what it's asking. And we call that response set. And we don't want that to happen in a measure like this. So a good way to break up the response set is to ask questions that have different directions. It pushes the clients to think more carefully about the wording, and it also breaks up this idea that the answer to a previous question is going to influence the next answer. It's kind of, among ourselves, we talk about this like saying, yeah, a string of similar answers. So mixing the direction is a good way to do that. And then I would also say, I mean, it gives you a better range of responses. So when the bond is really poor, you're going to have clients agree with those negative items. And that provides a sort of a lower floor than you would have if they were all positive.
Well, yeah, that I think that resonates with me, so appreciate it. Maybe in the interest of time, let's jump right into the Q&A, and I've now got 2 boxes on my screen. I'm going to try and navigate these questions as best as possible. We certainly saw quite a few upvotes and a lot of action here. So let's sort of start with the as I flip through the one with the most votes here. So I have one with 9 votes, and it's maybe I'll tie it into a couple of other questions, and Brent asked this one to you. So Alice asked, why BR-WAI instead of the WAIS? And then I want to tie it into a couple other questions that I thought were interesting. So if I can find them. So Scott asked, what prompted developing the brief version of the WAI? Was it just to make it easier and less questions? Any other reasons? And then another question from an anonymous attendee about, again, why it was revised from the 36-item version. So I think if we sort of wrap this up into one question for you, Brent, like, what prompted the creation of the BR-WAI, and why not use measures that are already there, like the full WAI, or I believe the WAIS was already in practice when your team started?
There are a couple of short versions. Yeah, so here's my burrito answer, rolling things together. 36 items is a lot to ask clients to complete. And in research, we're giving subjects maybe extra credit or payment. So that's a different story than when they are our clients. So finding the briefest measure that will do the job is important. And there are several other researchers that developed short versions of the Working Alliance Inventory. One of the statistical methods that I know about is called item response theory. And it allows you to pick a subset of items that packs in as much information as possible. So 36 items does measure more accurately than 18 items. The goal here, though, is to pick the 18 items that captures as much information as possible from the 36 items. And the previous efforts to develop a short measure of the Working Alliance Inventory did not use item response theory. So relatively more information is lost. One of the things that you get with IRT, this statistical technique, is a very high ceiling and a very low floor that allows you to capture the full range of responses. The existing short forms tend to be concentrated in either the upper end or the lower end. So that's sort of a technical answer. 18 items is a good compromise between losing too much information and having a scale that's too long. So we look for a short measure because that's the one that clients will fill out, and that's the one that clinicians will use. And we want to capture as much of that original information as possible.
Great, thanks, Brent. And if I'm understanding correctly, when we're comparing the BR-WAI against other shortened versions, the simple answer here is this: the validity and the psychometric properties of the BR-WAI are holding up better against the original WAI.
That's right. And if our viewers want to go into the technical details, that original article, 2015 article, shows some charts that I hope are clear that the version that we created has a better range of capturing information. So we capture the poor alliances better than some of the other measures. We capture the high functioning alliance better than some of the other measures.
Great. That's perfect. Thanks, Brent. So the next two questions here are sort of the most votes I can see right now. So 12 and 11. I'm actually going to ask the one from Diane first, and Emily, maybe we'll start with you. So the question is, I question the accuracy in clients self-reporting directly to the therapist. Does this add an additional burden for them? And Emily, I want to ask you first, because in the way that you talked through delivering this measure, you sort of said there's two different versions in which there's different ways in which you use it. And if I really simplify it, sometimes you use it and have the client complete directly with you and in front of you. And other times they do it outside of the session on their own independent time. So curious if you can share a bit about your perspective on that and how you feel about accuracy in both contexts.
Absolutely. So when the clients take it on their own in, the comfort of their own homes, on their cell phones or laptops, tablets, whatever they use, I have not really seen much of a difference between when they do that on their own and then when I'm quite literally clicking for them the answer in sessions. I've seen very little difference. I mean, I didn't run like a t-test or an ANOVA to find that out, but I've seen very little difference between the two. I do understand your question though of like, well, if you're sitting in front of them and you're going to be seeing these answers, maybe how accurate is that in the first place? And I would maybe guess that maybe the first couple times they take it, maybe that's true, right? Maybe the first few times they take this assessment, it's maybe not completely authentic to how they're feeling about you. But over time, I mean, that takes a lot of effort to keep putting up this, I guess, mask, you could say, that, oh yeah, I'm totally cool with my therapist, or alternatively, no, she's the worst, right? So I think as long as you as a clinician approach this humbly and genuinely, they tend to see you as a person and give you honest feedback, especially when you're willing to take that feedback seriously as well.
And Brent, maybe if I flip the question to you from a research perspective, forgetting whether it's direct in person with a client or clients doing it outside a session, in either case, like the results are still flowing to the provider. How is sort of this concept of accuracy and honesty from the client flowed into the research conversation about working alliance?
It's such a good question from our viewer. One of the things that we worry about is that some of the poorest alliances, clients are reluctant to rate them as poor as they actually experience them. Sort of like, how good is your boss? Well, your boss has some power over you, and bad bosses probably sometimes get some good ratings if they're not anonymous, so we're worried about that aspect. But this is where repeated measurement comes in, that maybe the first time we administer the BR-WAI, the ratings are less trustworthy, especially for those clients that really are struggling in their alliance. But then Emily has just given some great advice today about how you make use of that feedback. And I think you can use the feedback from the first measure to build trust, to show the client you're not going to react defensively, that actually a good thing comes from talking about these numbers and that the relationship improves. And so I would expect for those problematic alliances that the second administration will go much better if we respond non-defensively and helpfully the first time.
Right. So then the most upvoted question here from Kelsey, we're going to get to next. So how do you think about patient to provider fit alongside the ability to build alliance? So is there ever simply a bad fit, and what is that typically based on? So if there's a bad fit, is that based on demographic, specialty, tone, something else? Or is the concept really that a great provider can create a strong alliance with any patient? Kind of curious both perspectives on this. And so maybe Brent, I'll throw it to you first. And kind of talking through this concept of, is there such thing as just a bad fit that we have no control over as a provider?
I think there are poor fits. I prefer the word poor fit. There's a poor fit in terms of the client's needs and what the therapist's strengths are. At the same time, some research I would recommend to your viewers is some work from Bruce Wampold and I think Greg Brown, or Brown and Wampold. They worked with the Kaiser Permanente panel of therapists on the West Coast. And one of the things that they found is, from massive amount of data, that some therapists in that pool seem to work well with every one of the clients that they get. A wide range of diagnoses. And so there seem to be master therapists that can provide a good match for almost any client that they see. They also found some therapists in the pool that don't seem to work well with nearly any client that they see. So sort of a darker side of this. I think that as we gain training and experience and are motivated to get better at our craft, that there are more and more clients that become a good match for us. But it's never 100% of the clients. And I think we need to recognize that. And measurement tools like GreenSpace provides, I think, helps us identify those times when there's not a good match. And we decide that the client might be better served to be assigned to someone else. I think that happens, and there's no shame in that. I think clients get a choice, and if they don't feel, this is what I tell people that I refer for therapy is, if you don't have a good feeling about your therapist after 3 or 4 sessions, then try to find somebody else that you do feel a connection to, and that's understandable.
Right. And Emily, curious your perspective.
So I think Brent actually did a really great job of covering that. I think depending on the therapist you ask with this question, I think a theoretical approach sometimes can inform that answer. So at least with my belief, I'm not speaking for all therapists in the world. I think that, you know, if there's a therapist that fits every single client, something's up. I don't know. And this is why I mentioned before that it is a relationship, just like anything else in our lives. And so so because it's a relationship, think about like your personal life. There are people that you probably met that you just don't jive with for whatever reason. Maybe they give you the ick. Maybe it's the way they look. Maybe it's the way that they say milk. I don't know. But for whatever reason, you just don't like them. And the same thing goes for therapists in the way that clients look at their therapists as well. It's not always personal. It might not have anything to do with your capability as a clinician. Sometimes it's just the way that someone's perceiving you from life experience, or something as shallow as what you were wearing that day. I think there are definitely instances where it is not a good fit. And I would hope that a client eventually would feel comfortable enough to tell me, I don't think this is working. And that would be a conversation to have then as well.
Right. Thanks, Emily. So we're in our last few minutes here. I have maybe see if we can get to like 2 very quick hitter questions, and we'll do this rapid fire. So one that was upvoted quite a bit, and Brent, maybe I'll ask this one to you, because we've heard sort of Emily's use of this in practice, but how frequently should we be using this assessment as a general question?
Oh my goodness. Wow. Well,
maybe
I think
not a rapid fire response. So.
Well, let me try to be brief. I think clients can be tired from it. They can be fatigued from over measurement. And part of this is, how many other instruments are you administering? We did a research study in which we repeated this instrument every 4 sessions, so basically about every month. And clients seemed to tolerate that pretty well, and it gave great information about what relationships were improving, what relationships needed work. So if you're pressing me on a frequency, I'd say once every 4 months. More than that, and you risk fatiguing a client. And really, are you going to use that information? You know, we should never give an assessment where we don't use the data.
Right. That's helpful. And I just want to clarify, when you said once every 4 months, do you mean 4 weeks?
I'm very sorry. You once every month, once every 4 weeks. Thank you.
All good. That the response didn't quite line up with the
yeah.
All good. And then the one final one, which again, extremely rapid fire. There was sort of questions about using the measure in different contexts, and one of those was with young children. So somebody's sharing that, you know, their youngest is 4. I'd say, from what I understand, there are therapeutic alliance measures validated for different client populations and settings, and the BR-WAI would be one that's validated with an adult population. But Brent, maybe I'll throw that one back to you as well, just in terms of age range for the specific measure.
Yeah, we have never used it with people less than 18, and measures are valid only for certain populations. So it's not been validated outside of that age range. It doesn't mean that maybe if you're working with children, you can't adapt some of these items for yourself. Like, how would I ask a 6-year-old if they agree about, is our time being spent well? But it definitely needs to be adapted. And then the validity as far as comparison to norms, it isn't there yet. But you point to a good need. And then probably it wouldn't surprise me if there are compliance measures for younger clients.
Yeah, there is. I mean, on the platform, we've seen groups utilize measures that are child report and parent report in that context. So again, with measurement generally, I think we always want to be thinking about validity for and fit for a client population and setting. So I'm gonna sort of call things there, and a couple closing thoughts and remarks from me. So, you know, we spent quite a bit of time talking about therapeutic alliance here. Hopefully this was really valuable to everybody. Like, ultimately, this concept is vitally important to providing care. It's a really effective component of measurement-based care, as we've seen with our partners. And so we highly encourage each of you and each of your teams to try it out if you haven't used it already. We also find that this generates very valuable data for clinical supervision and an organization's leaders, and being able to really understand, you know, not just, you know, supporting providers, but fit of certain programs and care pathways for different individuals. So really, really meaningful use of the data from this to continue to drive better quality of care. Now, to wrap things, a huge thank you to Brent and Emily. A huge thank you to all of the attendees here. You know, at GreenSpace, we are continually working on educational events that we think will be relevant and valuable to, you know, clinical leaders, service providers, researchers, et cetera. We hope that our next one is as exciting and well attended as this one. If you're interested in talking more about this topic or implementing measurement-based care more generally, we're here for you. We encourage you to reach out, and I'm sure Brent and Emily are also happy to continue the conversation offline. And then my last request, please complete the survey at the end of this so we can gather your feedback. So thank you, everybody, and we hope you have a great afternoon.